Well-known Canadian-born U.S. political writer and commentator David Frum was on Parliament Hill today to testify before a Senate committee studying the federal government's proposed changes to election laws. And he has some concerns on where that legislation is headed. David Frum is with me now to talk about that, and maybe we'll get to some other things in the Canada-U.S. relationship. But let's start with your testimony today. You appeared before the Senate committee today to raise some concerns as an expat living in the United States, living outside Washington, about these proposed election changes. What worries you about allowing expat Canadians to vote in elections in this country?
Well, I am one of those who I think would be enfranchised by this provision. I've made my principal residence in the United States since 1996. I was naturalized in 2007, and the law purports, at least on its face, to give me the right to vote, even though I also vote in the United States and pay most of my taxes there. What I'm concerned about is that the law does not begin to take seriously the problem of cross-border election interference, which has become such a huge issue, not only in the United States, but as we now see in the Brexit debate in the UK, an attempt to sway the French election in 2017. So far, the world has had mostly to deal with Russian manipulations, which are crude and obvious. I think that we are seeing the beginnings of China using those same kind of strategies to advance its state ends. There are a lot of Canadian citizens, a lot of Canadian passport holders resident long-term in Hong Kong and soon in mainland China. They are subject to pressures. This is a state that monitors very closely what residents and citizens do. China does not recognize dual citizenship. It believes all Chinese-born people are subject to China first. And it has extraordinary surveillance capabilities and extraordinary capabilities to press people to do things it wants.
Okay, the current law that was brought in by the Conservatives restricts voting from expats to, I think, 5 years outside the country, and with a clear intent to at some point return. This would change that. It would do away with that rule. What's a better option? What's a better option than allowing, people who live outside this country, no matter how long or whether they intend to come back, to vote freely in elections in this country?
Well, Canada does not remove your citizenship. So if you are a long-term expat and you maintain deep ties to Canada, you can, at any time in your life, renew your residency and return to Canada and then resume voting.
Right.
So when people talk about this as removing people's voting rights, that's not accurate. What it does is, after 5 years, it suspends the voting rights for the period that you're outside the country. Any kind of rule always has an element of arbitrariness. Really, is there such a difference in 100 kilometers an hour and 102? But rules are liberty enhancing. They allow people to plan, and they protect the integrity of systems.
How do you see this working? So how do you see a Canadian expat living outside the country preparing to vote in an election? How do you see that person being taken advantage of, or that process being taken advantage of by a country that might be unfriendly to Canada, or might try to disrupt the democratic process here?
That's a great question. So let's think specifically about how this works. There are hundreds of thousands of Canadians resident, or Canadian passport holders, dual nationals, resident in Hong Kong and soon in mainland China. The Chinese government monitors their behavior very closely. And it doles out, it doesn't just send you to prison if it does. They have this whole system of social credit, where if you do what they regard as pro-social actions, you get an enhanced score. If you do what they see as anti-social actions, this affects your ability to rent housing. This affects your ability to get business credit, to get your zoning requests approved. So if the Chinese government, for example, said, we would urge you to vote against person X or in favor of person Y.
In Canada, in a Canadian election.
And we would encourage you to register. And if you register, that will enhance your social credit. And if you vote the way we tell you, it will. And although the ballot is secret, supposedly, everyone knows the Chinese are easily able. The Chinese state has the capacity to open envelopes and see what's inside and reseal them in a way that Canadian authorities will be very unlikely to detect.
Okay. So the option would be what then? If you're an expat, and when you leave Canada, and you're, let's say, in the case of David Frum, you're living in the United States for, it doesn't matter what length of time, you don't get to vote, period.
You don't get to vote so long as you remain outside Canada. Should you return to Canada? Should you resume paying taxes in Canada? Should you resume being closely involved with the country? Then your voting rights would return. So you would have this period where, as your connection to Canada attenuates, so gradually does your involvement in the Canadian political process.
It won't be lost on people that you're living in the United States, and America doesn't do that. Americans outside the U.S. get to vote.
Well, yes and no. I think, and we talked about this at the Senate today. One of the differences in Canada and the United States is in Canada the right to vote is really a right. In the United States, the right to vote is just the start of the process. And lots of Americans who have a theoretical right to vote are in fact prevented from voting. So Americans abroad must re-register every year, must re-register every change of address. And then they're subject to a battery of state laws, because most of the rules governing voting in the United States are at the state, not the federal level. And that's why there are very few long-term expat votes cast in the United States, because the United States makes it really difficult. Now, I don't approve of this at all. I think that the written laws should be the actual laws. But Canadians who compare Canada and the United States need to understand that what America says the voting rights are, that's not actually how it really works for most people who experience it.
Okay, well, while I've got you, let me pivot to something else. The G20 is underway in Argentina.
Yeah.
Canada and the U.S. are expected tomorrow in Mexico to sign the new trade agreement. What does that mean to the process? Okay, they sign it. What happens? Does that mean Canadians should be sitting back thinking, okay, that's a done deal given the new look U.S. Congress?
Well, I think it won't have significant trouble in Congress, partly because it's so little different from the old NAFTA. It's really NAFTA minus. It's NAFTA, but a little bit worse. It's like a Trump redevelopment. And I think Congress will be very keen to send a message of friendship to Canada, and getting this thing off the table is a message of friendship to Canada. The real heartbreaking thing about this deal is NAFTA was signed in the early 90s. The U.S.-Canada agreement that is the core of it is from the 1980s. There's so many areas in which it is indeed out of date, in which there are opportunities to be picked up. NAFTA was created before the rise of the internet. So as anyone who's tried to do cross-border internet shopping has discovered, that border is very thick, or for streaming video services, or for a whole range of elements of the modern economy. So what was needed was a NAFTA for the 21st century. And there's so many opportunities to generate wealth on both sides of the border, including Mexico as well. And that was just missed because of Trump's destructive attitude and his focus on, he made a false claim that NAFTA was harmful, and then he created a false problem, which is renegotiating the whole thing from the start. And then he created a false claim of success by taking what is basically the same deal, repackaging it, and giving it a new name.
Right, and the tariffs remain. He's made a big deal of tariffs too, and a lot of people suggested Canada shouldn't sign this deal till the tariffs were lifted on aluminum and steel, but they don't seem to be coming off, and he's even talking about the possibility of more tariffs. New crisis with China. Mm-hmm.
No, it's just heartbreaking, because there are things that really need to be done. It should be possible for Canadians and Americans to be able to buy goods on either side of the border and have them shipped across by internet, meeting the legitimate concerns about security. Right. Taxation, other kinds of issues that both countries have. People of goodwill can solve these problems if they're given the chance to do it.
David Frum, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you.